Hello and welcome to the Lean Change Management podcast. I'm Richard Atherton. I'm a Lean Change agent and facilitator, and I am delighted in this episode to have a very special guest who is a prolific writer on LinkedIn, who attracted me initially with some of his writings on bureaucracy, which we'll get into. His name is Venkatraman Ramachandran, otherwise known as Venki. And welcome to the show, Venki.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Okay, so we had a conversation, Venki and I, before this about how we'd run this, and it's going to be less interview style and more of a conversation. So, like I said, I expect one of the themes to be around bureaucracy. I think that's an interesting area, especially for the lean change management audience. We may get into some of the other topics you've written about, personal work. I know that, like me, you're a yogi, and I know you've picked up some martial arts recently. I saw that in your writings. Something perhaps around being human, and storytelling is another theme that comes through. So those were the topics that came to mind for me. We may go to other places. Let's see. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's start with what first drew me to your writing, and that's this topic of bureaucracy. So tell me a little bit about what interested you and your early findings in your research into that area.
I actually quite serendipitously landed on bureaucracy. I'm a big fan of David Graeber's works, and having worked in technology for quite a while, I've always been fascinated by, I was actually a sort of an internet evangelist in the early 2010, who would be an unabashed supporter of, all the virtues of the web.
The virtues of the web,
yeah, the virtues of the web. But over time, I think I've learned and life has taught me much more. To kind of temper my optimism about the web and the internet and the technology. So it's been an exploration all along in terms of, why do we still have many problems despite the availability of technologies that could help us, in our problems. So I'm kind of framing it as a very broad set of question here. So what bureaucracy helped me was to kind of nail down certain areas where I've always felt I've kind of groped in the dark in terms of the limitations of how technology could understand the social reality in which we find humans in.
Okay.
So I think bridging that chasm between where humans are and their complex social reality, and placing them in context with the technology and our mythologies of change, especially with related to technology. I think it's in that intersection where I kind of discovered the bureaucracy, and it's been and I don't think I've just barely scratched the surface. It's a fascinating subject which helps me even explore newer set of problems that I thought I could connect the dots between them.
Okay. And I got a sense there that perhaps so is it that you see bureaucracy as a problem, or just how do you see bureaucracy as a topic to be tackled? How do you view it?
So I see bureaucracy more from the technological lens, as a certain form of an organizational technology which helps you manage things in a certain scale. So whenever you're managing humans and resources, and distinguishing them between the two, whenever you manage both humans and resources in scale, inevitably you land up with some forms of bureaucracy.
Okay.
So not all of them are good, not all of them are bad. So it's going to be always going to be a push and pull between what the what the humans want and what the processes and what the technologies want. So kind of
Mm.
navigating those tensions is where bureaucracy plays a very crucial role.
Right. Okay. And I liked a definition that you quoted in one of your articles from Neil Postman, a coordinated series of techniques for reducing the amount of information that requires processing.
Yeah, and if you kind of look, I mean, the if you kind of look at our own, the way our lives have been organized, we've been part of many such technologies of bureaucracy, which have helped us move on. Like for instance, school is a form of a technology, if you look at it from that lens, which helps you assess this entire complex notion of intelligence and knowledge into certain defined set of evaluation or assessments that's easier for somebody to evaluate somebody.
Okay. Yes.
You know,
Yes.
so you could see technology, you could see schools also from that lens, or you could see many other social setups where we've created, which helps us understand fairly more complex, like like take the case of intelligence. Our understanding and notions of intelligence are fairly complex terrain, but
Mm.
where schools help us is to uh, put an imaginary map around that terrain and call that imaginary representation a certain form of knowledge which can be easily measured and quantified, and so on and so
Mm-hmm.
forth.
Okay. Uh, so it can be a good, perhaps as Neil Postman suggests, and then you've got another quote here, which I think which is interesting again from David Graeber, which you mentioned at the start here. What lies behind the appeal of bureaucracy is fear of play.
Hmm.
Can you say more about that?
Yeah, so just to clarify on the previous point, I don't think Neil Postman was referring to that definition as a way to implicitly to imply that bureaucracy is for good. So
Right.
he sees it more as matter of factly, and given his conservative background, he is slightly more, I would say, inclined to seeing it as evil.
Okay.
And that you can actually easily deduce that when you read his fabulous book called Technopoly. So although I have some disagreements in certain things, the way Neil Postman has written, and I have great reverence for his knowledge and his beautiful writing. But yeah, there are certain disagreements that I have in certain perspectives. Coming to what you mentioned about play, as a musician uh, and a person who has worked in helping organizations collaborate, I've always been fascinated by understanding the dynamics that happens whenever I do play in context outside my work, where I jam with my friends and make music. So I have a small band of sorts where we kind of jam and play in the weekends. So and the kind of jamming happens, if you closely look at that jamming as a process, purely from the musical creative lens, and also from the technological lens that I wear when I work on collaboration based projects. I was very fascinated to see the parallels in those two worlds. You know,
Mm.
while it seemed very effortless for open-ended freestyle collaboration to happen whenever I jammed with my friends, it was always a problem whenever I tried something of that kind. Whenever I was trying to do something of a similar kind, jamming in an organization, using
Mm.
probably an enterprise social network.
Yes.
So it was that question which, why is jamming so difficult to do in an organization while it is so easy to do while you're with your friends and
Yes.
making music. So that is a question which kind of fascinated me to explore the notion and meaning of play, and kind of try to see, where is there some insight that could help me understand that. And I think that's where David Graeber's and that quote that you mentioned in terms of talking about the fear of play, it kind of goes deep into that part in terms of why we humans, in some sense, have a lot of fear about open-ended play, improvisational play whenever
Yes.
we are in certain social context.
Yes. 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 That's interesting. I'm just thinking of a session I went to last night where called Embodied Agile, where we were encouraged to, well, part of the session was an improvisation where we had to act out some scene based on a few words, and perhaps only 20 or 30% of an audience of maybe 40 or 50 were willing to stand in the center of the circle and play in that way. So I think, so perhaps that's what David's talking about. There is this tendency amongst humans to fear that, exposing themselves in that way, and bureaucracy provides a safe haven. Is that perhaps what he's saying?
Uh, I, I wouldn't. I mean, kind of say that humans by nature are, have that fear. I think it's a lot more complex than that. What has happened is in a largely social setting, and that's where it kind of points to our earlier conversation about, where the social reality coming in and where technologies are coming in. I think to a large extent, whenever we are in certain spaces, the way we negotiate social realities change.
Mm.
You know, so we feel more comfortable in places where we have to do less effort to negotiate that social reality amongst ourselves.
Right. Okay.
So the term which is kind of very interesting, and I'll elaborate on the term which David Graeber uses in his book as a term called interpretive labor.
Okay.
So interpretive labor is the effort humans make to understand each other's social reality.
Mm.
So his point of contention is that in organizations, and there are only very few people who are willing to do the efforts to understand the social reality.
Okay. Interesting.
So bureaucracy is imposed in places where there isn't much of free flowing understanding of the social reality. When there is not much of interpretive labor happening between those who wield power and those who don't, then there is a strong need for a technology like bureaucracy to come in.
I see. Okay.
So if I don't want to understand, if I don't want to, let's take this conversation for instance.
Yeah.
Let's imagine where you are my boss and you are asking me to have this conversation with you. Okay.
Okay.
Just for the sake of our conversation.
Yes.
So now what will happen is, if you understand my social reality, you could probably gauge whether I am ready to have a conversation.
Mm.
Right?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
if you're not willing to do that interpretive labor, then you might use the power of bureaucracy and say, I want you to come and join the conversation.
Yes.
So do you see the difference here?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So I really like this term interpretive labor here, because it helps me understand some of those black holes that happens oftentimes when, even though we have good technologies that are set up to enable and foster collaboration doesn't happen.
Mm.
And perhaps understanding why this interpretive labor is often not happening amongst people, like not happening amongst humans in an organizational context, could probably give us some clues about why collaboration isn't happening.
I see. And so based on that argument, would you say the reason that you find it more easy to play with your friends when you jam at the weekends is a lot of that interpretive labor has been done by you and your friends? That investment has been made and now you're free to play.
Exactly. So
right.
That labor is, they know the way I am, they know my quirks, they know my idiosyncrasies, they know everything about me. So I am far more open and vulnerable when I'm in that kind of a free play creative zone when I make music.
Yes.
Whereas,
but the reason you're able to express yourself in that way is because that investment in interpretive labor has been made, and you've reached a place of safety, or whatever term we might use, amongst your friends to be able to express yourself in that way.
Yes, and that space is often missing whenever I walk into a large multinational corporation where I am part of a team, and very few times with very few sets of people, you are able to break that barrier and kind of make that investment. I mean, I'm using the term investment
Mm.
slightly loosely here, but when that investment isn't made for that interpretive labor, then it becomes extremely difficult to enforce certain activities. Then that's where technologies have to come in and bureaucracy have to come in to enforce and get things done.
Right, because there isn't the willingness, for whatever reason, that interpretive labor isn't happening, and these spaces that enable creativity and let's say free flowing collaboration to happen is not happening, and so then why? Yeah, so why do we then need bureaucracy? What role is it playing?
Yeah, exactly. So bureaucracy fills that need. So wherever there is that lacunae in terms of uh, in where humans are not willing to negotiate and understand their social realities among themselves, then we need the technology that can make it easier for so David, being an anarchist, in his book uses that to kind of frame that the people who are the bottommost of the pyramid are the ones who spend most of the time trying to understand, if you can imagine a conversation, like, what mood the boss is in,
Mm,
those kind of conversations happen only at the lower end, trying to understand, make the effort for the investment in the interpretive labor towards the top, whereas from the top there's not much of effort coming then. The way David frames this is, it's always labor is outsourced to the bottom of the pyramid, whereas it doesn't happen where the ones who are at the top of the pyramid don't take in the don't give in the enough amount of efforts to kind of understand what may be the social reality of somebody who's there at the bottom of the pyramid.
okay. And so the way to, in order for the organization to function and to have, as Postman talks about, techniques for allowing the information processing within the organization, we use bureaucracy in place of something that might occur more organically had more of that interpretive labor been done across the organization. Is that right?
Yeah, like for instance, if I were to ask you in a conversation about how you're feeling today, what you would describe to me is a fairly complex uh, tableau of what all you're going through, and
Mm,
only if I were to, and imagine me doing this via a survey. A survey is just going to ask you between in a Richter scale of between 1 to 5, how are you feeling today?
mm,
Right?
yeah,
So now the latter approach makes it efficient, but it completely loses out all the nuances and details. And I think that's the technique of bureaucracy Neil Postman is highlighting here. That it makes, for me to understand what's your feelings there, the bureaucracy is giving me techniques that makes the information, both retrieval and understanding them slightly more efficient.
I see. Okay. But perhaps at a cost of some creativity, or as you say, some nuance, or there may be some opportunity missed um, in it, in the act of processing information in that way.
Yeah, I think it's more than opportunities. It's more about, there are multiple dimensions of our social realities. So, by the very act of bringing in these sort of information processing systems, we reduce the number of dimensions to those which we can handle and manage.
Mm, I see. Okay.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is interesting. There's a couple of light bulbs going on for me here. So when we talk about lean, um, my mind is drawn back to the Toyota production system, and in that case, we have these very strong relationships between the sensei, or the lean master, and the apprentice. And as I see that through this lens, I can see there is a very deep investment in interpretive labor, in understanding the social reality of those who are being mentored to solve problems on a production line.
Mm-hmm.
And equally, in an agile context, we see investment in ceremonies like the Agile Retrospective, for example, where there is again quite a deep investment in in the social realities of the team members, and a lot of work done in terms of interpretive labor of what's happening there. Yeah.
Yeah, rituals do play a significant role in helping us understand our social realities.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. There's a couple of places to go here. Why don't we go first, actually, to this idea of debugging bureaucracy? Well, first of all, what do you mean by debugging? Let's start there.
I mean, so if bureaucracy is going to be a technology, then naturally you would want to kind of iterate further and refactor those systems in which probably could accommodate humans to be humans. So that's the whole idea of debugging bureaucracy. So the idea is not to treat it as something outside and as an embodiment of evil, or like many authors in the past have kind of looked bureaucracy as, but also see if some of these systems are can be further evolved and could help us accommodate ourselves where we are.
Right. Okay. And then you talk about working out loud as being an important part of debugging democracy.
Yeah. So working out loud, I think I think before the term got invented, most of us who were early adopters in an enterprise social network were fairly bringing together some of the activities that are right now coined under working out loud. So typically when we start spending time, when you're working out loud, you are talking about the everyday aspects of your work, in terms of which also involves a lot of interpretive labor, where you understand all the social realities, you interact with people, you kind of see what's the kind of mode of communication somebody prefers. So you kind of get all that nuances which are not often captured within by systems. So working out loud is an approach to kind of have this ability to do this sort of build the social reality around you. Typically, whenever you are working out loud, you're also doing a lot of sense making. What is the term that is used for you to understand what's happening in the air, get some situational awareness about what is happening in in a certain organization. So the working out loud helps you in multiple ways, not just to negotiate the social boundaries between people, but also for you to get a sort of a lay of the land as to what's happening, and get a more ant's eye view of things.
Ant's eye view, I love that. I noticed one of the graphics on one of your posts, you enumerated 4 dimensions for working out loud. So validating out loud, sharing out loud, asking and answering out loud, and exploring out loud. I like that.
Yeah, so that was based on the community roundtables framework that they had. So I think the biggest challenge in kind of facilitating all these kinds of dimensions of work out loud is more often for good or bad, whenever we are in a network, the immediate impulse is to present the best self, and so you're always, in some sense, you're always doing some personal branding of sorts. And that's also sort of a significant barrier whenever you're doing this work, whenever you're working out loud, because to work out loud and to understand somebody, one needs a certain kind of vulnerability. If I'm always in a personal branding mode where I am making myself look more romantic and sexy than what it is,
yeah,
then it's extremely difficult to work out loud. So so that I think that is one of the areas that I also kind of briefly touched upon. So which is, although we've invented networks, we love to broadcast, and kind of I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I'm just pointing out that even when we build networks which can easily help us connect in various ways, we still love to prefer the kind of the one-way broadcasting systems that help us not oftentimes understand what's happening around us.
Okay.
Yeah, those are kind of some of the structural challenges that are always there whenever you're working out in a network.
So working out loud doesn't just mean making it public, it means approaching the work or approaching the working out loud with a level of vulnerability. So being open to be wrong if you're seeking validation, or perhaps getting an answer you don't want if you're asking a particular question. That vulnerability is key. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. So if I'm asking for if I'm asking for something, I should be willing to admit that I may be wrong with wherever I am.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. The other thing that comes to mind is, as part of lean change, we encourage working out loud. Very specifically, we have this idea of the big visible wall. So if you're conducting any kind of change activity, then find ways to physically make the work that you're doing public. And of course, there could be electronic versions of that. But what comes to mind now is that when I think about it, often when I've encouraged clients to adopt that type of approach, it's been very much team-led. So it's been the team's expression, which perhaps would help to mitigate the risk of it becoming an individual's broadcast. And if it's the team's, I mean, the team, I suppose, can adopt a kind of collective ego. But even so, I think by encouraging teamwork in that way, we might minimize the risk of it becoming a sort of ego broadcast.
Yeah, I think team, when you're dealing with teams, what gets passed out as the artifact, how much is being owned, it's the key. Yeah.
And then playing, you also refer to encouraging play as being part of debugging bureaucracy, which I guess takes us back to where we touched on earlier.
Yeah.
I suppose we could see that as being another way of, well, in two ways, I suppose. There's the benefits of play in terms of the creativity it elicits, and perhaps unexpected outcomes and new ways to look at old problems. But I can also see it as a way of understanding social reality. So it's perhaps a more fun way of making that interpretive labor investment.
Yeah, when you kind of bring in the play elements in working out loud, what gets revealed is you are actually tapping on the serendipity of the network. When I post a question on LinkedIn, I'm always amazed by the kind of responses I get, because oftentimes it's very difficult to predict what kind of serendipities will come in. Somebody would have liked it, and then somebody would have would see a certain context from when as they view that update, and from that context they come up with a completely new response, which I never expected. So so the idea of play in working out loud is to kind of foster that serendipity and kind of ensure that you provide the necessary conditions which can foster serendipity. Obviously, you can't it doesn't have a direct relationship where I can say I need this way, especially when we're talking about terms like serendipity. So, but how do we foster and how do we bring in that sort of that conviviality of sorts?
Yeah.
So no, I think that's how do you bring that, and that's where it's always fascinating to kind of play around, for me at least in LinkedIn, because I love exploring different questions and see what kind of stories, and that's where stories come to play for me in the work I do. That so oftentimes I test out certain hypotheses in my mind and say, if I'm going to place this kind of a story, what sort of reactions it could evoke. And from that, is there something very interesting I could unearth about the dynamics of a certain social dynamics that are at play.
I see. Okay. And so that would come under the head, yeah, because I'm seeing this as well, back to your point about refactoring. I suppose you could see LinkedIn as an information processing system. So in that sense, you could see it as a bureaucratic tool, but being used in a playful way, and as being used as a storytelling platform.
Yeah, precisely. That's what I love, because here you have a platform, which kind of wants to completely glamorize the work that you want to do, and that's how the platform is designed for. It wants you to glamorize the work you do so that you spend more time uh, talking more and more polished stuff about the work you do, and I have great fun subverting those expectations.
Right. Okay. Yeah, and I've seen that actually. I've seen there's a there's a marketing executive who's had a lot of traction on LinkedIn talking about working in a shed and swearing and kind of blowing up the whole ideal of how you present yourself on LinkedIn. And it's had a lot of it's been very popular and a lot of success on LinkedIn as a result.
Oh yeah, swearing is the oldest tactic which has worked really well.
Yeah. Now, the final topic that you again introduced me to under the umbrella of bureaucracy is Parnell's iron law of bureaucracy. That is, in any bureaucratic organization, there are two kinds of people. The first, those that are devoted to the organization's goals, and the second, those that are dedicated to the organization itself. And the iron law states that in every case, the second group, those dedicated to the organization itself, will gain and keep control of the organization. Any thoughts on that?
Well, the fascinating thing is that it almost, when I hear it, it almost seems like the natural state of things.
Yes.
And I think and anyone who has worked in a large organization, for him, it is a part of a certain kind of natural reality. Any organization would have, folks who are more committed to the goals of the organization, and eventually, as it scales up, it has to bring in certain people who care more about the organization than its goals. And so eventually an organization is being built for a certain goal, which is what the truly the ends are. And Parnell's law kind of shows us how that whatever was the original ends, it gets completely swapped with the means that are there, and the means almost becomes the ends now. And I think, and that perversion may be too strong a word, but it is a fact. It is a fact that it does happen. So it very neatly encapsulates that perversion.
Yeah. And I suppose we can see that at the political level, and with governments, you could make that argument that governments become run for the politicians or the mandarins within the government, and less so for the betterment of the society that they purport to represent. And perhaps the same in organizations. What comes to mind there is the story of Jobs and ensuring that Johnny Ive reported directly to him. So was that consciously or otherwise a tactic to subvert that law and put somebody who was committed to, or let's say the goal of Apple was to make, I don't know, beautiful things that improve the state of mankind. And if Johnny was committed to that, then ensuring that he had a direct influence on Steve himself without that being mediated through any bureaucratic layers was perhaps an expression of subversion of that. What do you think?
Yeah, it is some sense of a subversion, and also it needed that kind of if I may use the word assholish leader at the top, who could kind of ensure that he has enough political muscle to break down on all the all the cogs of the bureaucratic machine.
Right. Okay.
So it needed that kind of a center of the sort of a gravitational force who could kind of go against the the cogs of the bureaucracy here, and that presence was very extremely crucial for work of a very superior kind, and I think, and that's where we see it in the products all over the world uses.
So perhaps that could be another plank in debugging democracy, is actually personnel, who you pick and where you place them in the hierarchy, where a hierarchy does exist, or at least a formal one does exist, then perhaps that's also key. Is who is given what remit where.
Well, I'm not too sure if it always has to have somebody at the top. I think it will eventually become maybe some part of the whole flow of things as one approaches certain scale. But uh, largely there are organizations that have run in a sort of uh, a more networked way when there is a very deep understanding of the social realities. And I mean, I'm coming back to what the original point was. If you talk about how movements come into place, so there's always something very organic about how the core gets evolved over time, and it is also fairly a more dynamic core. Even if you take most of the movements that have happened in the recent times, be it the Occupy movement or any other movements, if you see even anywhere in part of the world, you'd always notice that so those movements often have the enough energy uh, and they're able to control the entropy to a shorter period of time and get things done. But then if we want to make that as a permanent fixture, then you bring in these sort of technologies in place like a hierarchy or a bureaucracy and all that. So perhaps there may be ways to run organizations in other forms of technology. I think it's still an open area. We are still exploring, and yeah, I think that's what fascinates. I think both of us, I suppose, in terms
Yes.
of exploring that we have not yet arrived at a Bible book or a guidebook which says this is how things are to be done.
No, no, we haven't. But then one of the things we talk about in the lean change community is this idea of change as a social movement. Uh, but looking at it through the lens you've just provided there of it being a way to understand social reality, um, is an interesting one, right? If we've created a movement, we've created groups of individuals who understand each other's social reality very well, and that makes for very efficient sharing and highly creative groups. Um, that perhaps free from the heavier weight bureaucracies, then that's another interesting way of looking at change.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not pointing this as a completely utopian forms of
Mm,
organizing. I'm quite wary of that. Definitely there's going to be ego conflicts, and definitely there's going to be challenges in there. But how much are you willing to work with those tensions? I mean, and if you see the way holacracy defines, these moments. I mean, these tensions. I think I like the word tensions. When it comes to processing the conflicts that may emerge in smaller groups of people.
mm,
So oftentimes interpretive labor could also mean working with those conflicts as they are called as tensions, and coming to a certain resolution. And so I think it's very easy to kind of shove it down in a carpet and brush it under the carpet when you are a much larger organization where you don't care about what tensions are emerging from the bottom, when you have such a big hierarchy. But again, when you're going to have this sort of a alternative ways of organizing, then you have to address those core tensions that would evolve. And I say this from a lot of experience here. So one of the uh, voluntary work that I do is for an organic retail store in
mm.
Chennai. So I'm one of the volunteers there, and there we actually practice something called a sociocracy,
Oh
which
yes.
is an alternative form of organizing and getting work done. So we spend a lot of time talking about the tensions that we are holding, and so there we try as much. So that's another laboratory for me to kind of explore, how these alternative systems really stand up to the test of reality.
Right. Yes.
So, and,
Yes.
and that's where I realized that these systems, these alternatives that we are talking about, however rosy they might sound, they are not utopian solutions that can solve, or a panacea that can solve the problems of human, organizing.
No, no, no. That's very true. And of course, they bring in their own forms of bureaucracy. I think that's also interesting. If you look at the holacracy stuff, there's fairly significant levels of bureaucracy involved with some of that. Mm.
Yeah, and which is what makes this problem entirely a naughty one.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
exactly.
you could get caught. I mean, I one of the my pet uh, sort of fascinations about collaboration is that, you know, too much of collaboration can also be a pain, and too little of collaboration can also be a pain.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
and that's where that same holds true even in the case of bureaucracy. So even if you're trying to minimize bureaucracy through another system, you're getting caught in the same rut. So it's interesting. It's interesting, and definitely there's so much, given the kind of fact that now we now have tools that help us coordinate and cooperate in such large scales. Uh, you know, now I think it's going to be more interesting to explore how transient forms of organizing could be orchestrated at larger scale. And I think that's where, that's where I think the future is more interesting, in terms of how do we bring these uh, sort of transient forms of organizing, which could help job get things done. Like think of it like again a weekend jam. I jam with for a few hours, I make some music, everybody's having a good time, and then we pack our bags and move on.
right.
You know,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, that could be probably a metaphor for other forms of organizing which we still haven't yet tapped into.
Yeah, well, there's the concept of the flash organization, where at the moment, so examples of that are in the film industry, where a company is created specifically for a single movie. The movie's shown, the distribution happens, and then the company closes down. Perhaps we'll see that as a model for in other sectors. I think that's interesting. So perhaps a company gets formed for an IT project, let's say.
Yeah, why not?
To create an app, and once the app's created, I don't know. That sounds interesting to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I think now that we have networks where such flows of labor can be tapped into, think of it like streams. Where we have, I see LinkedIn as a certain kind of a stream where different people are and the work they do and the labors that they bring in are all intersecting. So who knows how somebody could create a nice little tributary which could tap into certain energies, certain fluid energies that are coming in out of these labor streams, and something interesting could happen. Like the flash is a perfect term here, because when we say flash floods, and that's a term which often uses, even it has a lot of fluid and liquid sort of meanings that are attached to that
Yes,
word.
yes,
So,
yes.
and right now, given the fact that work is also getting slightly more fluid, I think it's even more interesting to examine these fluid metaphors for organizing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. Which is at the core of a lot of the lean ideology, is this idea of flow, right? Managing flow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Good. I mean, I had some other topics here, but it feels like we've really had a good delve into bureaucracy and the potential ways of debugging democracy and the pros and cons. Is there anything else to say on that, or is this perhaps a good place to wrap up?
Yeah, I think yeah, we could wrap up. I think we've explored, I think.
Yeah. Great. Okay. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. I certainly feel like I've learned more through the course of this conversation.
Yeah, it was a pleasure, and I think I haven't. I mean, to be honest, I really don't know much about lean and the Toyotas and all that. So I'm learning more. So thank you.
Yeah, well, we'll certainly put some links to a lot of the reference here, the work of David Graeber and Neil Postman and some of the other people we've referenced.
Sure.
So thank you for your time, Venki.
My pleasure.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.